you get access to 2.5 hours of interviews that I recorded in 2013 with Mark Stetson and Ron Gress on one day, and then with Richard Taylor and Jim Dow on another day. And then this year, well, as I'm recording this, in 2014, Boyd Crompton interviewed myself, Mark Stetson, Richard Taylor, and Jim Dow, and then edited the whole thing and put it together, and he did a brilliant job. And in fact, we lost one of the 3 cameras that we had set up. So we only had a 2-camera situation, and Boyd made the best of it, and he did a great job. And that's 2.5 hours of incredible stuff. So here's a little snippet of, first of all, Mark Stetson and Ron Gress. Now, Mark worked with all of us on the whole model and on lots of the other models as well. And then also, he worked ahead of me, so I got to know him quite well. We became good friends to prepare the Enterprise to take paint. And Ron Gress is the artist who painted what is now called the strongback section, which we called the engineering section, which is where the pylons come into the fuselage. It's the bluey-greeny flat paint section, and that's the section of the Enterprise that Ron painted. So here is Ron and Mark at Mark's house.
About 2 months later, this was after I finished the job on Alcatraz, 2 months later I got a phone call from Paramount Studios to show up for work at 6 a.m. the next morning. Such and such a entrance.
You will be there.
Yeah. You were in San Francisco when you received the call.
Yes. So
and made a mold off of that, and then laid up a proper epoxy fiberglass part from the mold so that it would not warp again.
Right.
And I started fitting it to the saucer, and by sometime around there, it was like 36 hours had gone by, and so.
And now, here is Jim and Richard, and this is also in 2013, at the Pacific Dining Car Restaurant, Richard's watering hole, and it's a really snazzy place, and the prices are snazzy as well. And these 2 sets of interviews were recorded with my little tiny point-and-shoot Canon camera, but it did a pretty good job. So here is Richard Taylor, who designed the Starship Enterprise with Gene Roddenberry, banging heads with Gene, and Jim Dow, who built the Enterprise in conjunction with Gene Roddenberry.
Wait, rolling.
So we're talking about shooting models with motion control cameras and what evolved from Star. And you were saying
essentially on Close Encounters, I recall one specific instance where we were shooting the mothership in smoke, and we shot 26 passes in camera. This is rolling the film back, running the next pass, number 2, number 3, 26 passes in camera before the film was processed.
Yeah. And so you don't even know what you've got.
You got scratch negative.
Yeah, scratch negative or static. There's 2 things that will happen there.
Yeah. So we spend 3 days shooting this, and then it goes to the lab. We go home, sleep, and we get the call from the lab. We've got a scratch negative. We got to do it again. And we did that over and over and over again. I love the digital world.
Yeah, well, me too. But I'll tell you a fascinating thing about what he just said. The work that we did at Abel's and they did on Star Wars and all that was making multiple passes through the camera, okay? And you rewind and shoot, whether you're looking at a light box or a model or whatever it is. But you rewind, and you're shooting a scene that's like 12 feet long, okay?
Yeah.
And the labs, Tech 20 or whatever, they run thousands of feet through the labs.
And we're stick our little piece in there.
And we're giving them a 12-foot piece of film that has more time in it than
Yeah.
those thousands of feet of film.
Yeah.
But they don't know that.
Exactly.
And when
yeah.
I was working at Abel's, we had a problem with shit coming back from the lab because they just didn't know. So we ended up putting massive amounts of leader on the front and the back to get the printer up, the processor up and running. So when our little 12 feet went through there, it wasn't coming up to speed or whatever to get dailies.
Screwed up.
So
Now in 2014, I arranged with Boyd Crompton of TrekWorks, who is resident in Texas, who flew out to LA to interview us. And that is myself, Richard Taylor, Mark Stetson, and Jim Dow. And here is a little snippet from these interviews that were conducted at Mark's house. And as you'll see in the background, you'll see Mark's Oscar and his 2 BAFTAs. Mark is a very accomplished effects supervisor now and has been justly rewarded for his exceptional talents.
With the sort of the success of Star Wars and the sort of the public recognition of Star Trek once it had been elevated to a motion picture status, that had caught the eye of the union establishment in Hollywood, and it was hard for Jim to hire me. It took 5 months of waiting and pestering on my part and trying on Jim's part to wait for a window of time when
lunches with the union president.
It's been pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Finally, there was a point where the union was at full employment, and Jim was allowed to hire me as a specialist permit.
Right.
So, and then I ended up working on the picture for 3 different companies for a year and a half. Got all my hours in that I needed to become a full #1 card-carrying journeyman in the prop makers union.
Quite an accomplishment in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
Well, that's just where you began.
Makes sense.
We've got a lot more to talk to with Mark about that and the rest of his career. And Paul, how did you become involved with the picture?
Jim had grown up with and gone to school with a very, very famous airbrush illustrator named Charlie White, who had a studio on Santa Monica Boulevard, and a friend of mine shared the studio with him, who was an airbrush illustrator named Ed Scarisbrick. And Jim, you called Charlie.
Yeah.
So
we got to the point where we were reaching the primer stage, and we had nobody on staff. That we had so much work to do that we needed to hire someone to come in and focus on paint, nothing else. So I called Charlie.
But Susanna was working on it, wasn't she?
Yeah,
She had made a start.
She was kind of framing.
Yeah.
She actually she painted a lot of the Klingon and did a good job. But we needed her hands in the model shop.
Right.
I need somebody to just focus on paint. So I called Charlie, thinking that I could lure Charlie over because. Anyway, we have a long relationship, and he's on a roller coaster ride, and I thought I could buy his time for a month. I thought, well, it'll only take him.
Yes. Just knock it out.
Yeah.
well, that laughter is because of the complexity of the paint job on the Enterprise. It's kind of like the highlight on a painting. It's the last thing, the detail that's there. And in the case of the Enterprise, the paint job was an exceptional challenge because the paint job in the end is what gave it scale.
Mm-hmm.
When you have really smooth surfaces of things, and if you don't have some form of detail, you have no sense of scale.
Yeah.
So the Enterprise with these big sweeping curves, especially the saucer, and that's where his expertise came in, and us figuring out the patterning of those designs and coming up with the paint pigments and the way of applying them and all that. It was we were inventing it as we did it.
So I called Charlie, and Charlie says, "Well, I can't put the time into it, but I've got somebody else here." I don't know if he handed the phone to you or if he
No,
it back.
he handed the phone to Ed because they were in the same room and they faced each other,
Yeah.
And then he said to Ed, he says, "Don't you don't you have a friend of yours who's looking for work, who's pretty good with an airbrush? And then Ed said, oh, you know, he got your details, and he gave me a call. And so I'm at my studio in the La Bamba house up on the top of the Silver Lake Hills, and picked up the phone. He goes, Paul, it's Ed. How would you like to paint a Starship Enterprise?
Let me think.
Give me a minute, will you? So, and that was it. And
So
then
you came out with
I
some,
came down to see you, and I showed you my stuff, and you said, you know, I think you'll do. And Jim led me down the hallway, and
we just built
a spray booth.
spray
Yeah. And it was just down the hallway on the right before you walked into the main model room. And there she was, you know, as I said, with her wings spread, waiting for me to have my way with her.
What are you waiting for?
Looking very much like she looked in the dry dock on the film.
Right.
And Jim said, I mean, it was a heart-stopping moment. You know, I mean, here I was with the Enterprise, and it was up to me, and I had to take a big gulp, and I remember thinking, you know, Jesus, I'm really in deep here. And then Jim said that hadn't you restored or repainted, a 1935 Ford?
Yeah.
And you used pearlescent colors.
Right. Yeah, and that's
And then you suggested I do that. And then
so we started playing with pearls.
That's right, yeah. And
Well,
and then
that stuff was all made by Crescent, wasn't it?
Crescent. And they made 4 different colors.
Well, they made pigments though, incredible iridescent pigments of all kinds, and that stuff was incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure they still make it.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. And
Broad range of color now.
and they were, I remember, for a 4-ounce bottle, they were $48 each, which was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And
Because they were actually made with ground pearl.
Yeah, so they're iridescent.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that people see when you look at a seashell that has that iridescence on it, that's what the pigments were.
Yeah.
So when you look
Actually
at
pearl
the Enterprise at angles and the light would reflect it, each of those little panels had a different reflectivity and a different iridescence. So they were always fighting us, but in any case, there was a committee of about 8 to 10 people sitting there to look at every design, and then this free-for-all discussion would begin. And when they'd have astronauts, it would say, well, Mr. Taylor's design is exactly correct there, and Rodney would say, but that's not the way it's going to be in the future. And
I know.
And I would bring in footage that MIT had done, try and emulate what something would look like when it approached the speed of light, and I'd show that. And he'd say, no, that's not what happens when things go to the speed of light. I'd say, well, at MIT they're kind of thinking that, you know, no, in the future what's going to happen? Everybody go, okay. So he would tell astronauts, no, that's not the way it's going to be in the future.
Yeah.
And so this committee would vote, and I've learned after a while to, whatever I really wanted to be the design, I would bury it about 8 deep.
Yeah.
And they'd say, no, that's
Very
not good.
clever.
And then they'd argue over that. And then
Worry
they'd
about
argue, and finally they'd say, oh, that's good. And I'd say, really? Oh, okay, well, we'll go with that.
It's of its own before it was coated, and then the dicom is a very dark blue translucent material. It's a lacquer-based material that was sprayed on over the aluminum. So some of the iridescence of the aluminum came through the blue of the dicom. So in lighting that, that probably is why you see some other colors appearing.
Very interesting.
So there's a little taster, and as I say, you get about 6 hours total of some pretty interesting stuff.